The glass was cold enough to burn beneath Elara's palm. Inside the cafe, the world glowed with an amber warmth that felt less like light and more like a memory of something she had lost. Lamplight pulled on scrubbed wooden tables, polishing the grain until it shone. Through the frost-touched pane, she watched tin plates pass from hand to hand. A rhythm of community she was no longer part of. Someone inside laughed an easy, the full sound that didn't know the weight of silence, and another voice answered with a toast that made heads nod and cups lift in unison. The smell of roasted meat drifted through the seams of the door, rich and steady, hanging in the freezing air like a promise meant for other people. It was a cruel kind of perfume. Elara stood on the boardwalk and watched. A ghost, haunting the edges of a celebration. Snow had not yet fallen in earnest, but the night carried its warning in the sharp, metallic scent of the wind. The cold didn't just sit on the skin. It slipped under her coat and pressed itself against her ribs. An unwanted companion that seemed to know exactly where she was most hollow. She shifted her weight from one boot to the other, trying to keep the blood moving in feet that had walked too many miles. She tried not to stare at the plate. Nearest the window, a heap of potatoes slick with butter. A slice of beef, still steaming in the heavy air of the dining room. She told herself she was counting breaths. She told herself she was waiting for someone. Both were lies. She had arrived an hour earlier, walking the last mile from the depot with her valise bumping rhythmically, painfully, against her bruised knee. The address she carried copied twice on a scrap of paper to be sure. The ink, stiff and hopeful, had led her nowhere. It had led to a gap between buildings, a stretch of frozen dirt with no footprints, no lamplight, and no door to knock on. There was no house. There was no man waiting to claim the woman he had promised to marry sight unseen. She had stood there a long while in that empty lot, waiting for something to make sense of it. Nothing had. The silence of that empty space was louder than the wind. Now she stood here instead, outside the cafe, her stomach twisted, a physical knot of protest. She had eaten nothing since morning, just hard bread and coffee gone thin as water at a way station miles back. She pressed her lips together and looked away from the window, ashamed of her own hunger. That was when the memory rose up unbidden, soft as a hand laid on her shoulder. Eat slow, Elara. You'll make yourself sick. It was Clara's voice. Always gentle, always patient. Elara swallowed and almost laughed. A jagged sound in her throat. If Clara were here, she would have taken Elara by the arm and steered her inside without ceremony. She would have paid for the meal without letting Elara see the coins leave her purse. Preserving dignity as if it were fine china, Clara would have made a joke of it, then scolded her afterward for being proud when pride did no good at all. But Elara did not have Clara tonight. She didn't have anyone. She tucked her chin into her scarf and tried to remember why she was here. Why she had chosen a name on a piece of paper over the one her family meant to give her. She did not let the thought finish. Thinking about that would heat her blood. Anger was a fuel. Yes, but heat had nowhere to go in this cold. Suddenly, the cafe door opened. Warmth spilled out in a rush, a tangible wave that washed over her face before dissipating into the night. A man stepped onto the boardwalk and pulled his coat tight against the chill. He was striking, even in the dim light. He wore his hair long, tied back with a strip of leather, and his skin caught the lamplight in a way that marked him unmistakably as Apache. In this town, on this night, he stood out. Yet he moved with a quiet assurance that suggested he did not care. He held a paper parcel against his chest. Careful, cradling it as if it were a sleeping child. Elara looked down at her boots. The instinct to hide herself, overpowering. He paused. She felt it, without seeing it the way attention settles before words do. A shift in the air pressure between two people. When she finally looked up, his eyes were not on her face. They were on her hands, which were empty, trembling, and red from the cold. He did not ask her name. He did not ask what she wanted, or why a woman was standing alone on a boardwalk on Christmas Eve. He glanced once at the window behind her at the feast she had been coveting, then back at her face. "It's Christmas," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. He spoke as if that were explanation enough. People shouldn't go hungry on Christmas. She opened her mouth to refuse. "I'm not." The words caught in her throat. Pride rose fast and familiar. The old reflex she used to armor herself. She lifted her chin, ready to claim she was waiting for a carriage, for a husband, for anyone. "I'm not asking for charity," but he had already moved. The parcel was in her hands before she could finish her lie. Warmth bled through the paper and into her frozen palms. Shocking and immediate. She startled, the way a person does when touched unexpectedly after being invisible for so long, and he smiled. It wasn't wide, and it wasn't at her expense. It was just a small easing at the corners of his mouth. A recognition of shared humanity. "Merry Christmas," he said. Then he turned and went, his long strides carrying him down the boardwalk and into the dark. He did not look back. He did not wait for gratitude. Elara stood there with the parcel cradled against her chest. For a moment, a foolish impulse seized her. She considered running after him, calling him back to set the record straight. "I have a name. I have a past. I am not what you think." The thought made her huff a quiet laugh. A puff of white steam in the air. What did he think he had not thought at all? Not in the way she meant. He had seen a need and answered it. That was all. There was no transaction. No barter of pride for bread. She leaned against the rough wood of the post and unfolded the paper. Inside lay meat, bread, and a ladle of beans that still steamed. The smell made her dizzy. She ate standing up, right there on the boardwalk, because sitting felt like a luxury she had not earned. She ate slowly, forcing herself to pace the bites. Because Clara would have insisted, she let the warmth travel where it could, down her throat, settling into the ache of her stomach. By the time she finished, the cafe door had closed again, and the laughter inside had softened to a murmur. A world away. She folded the greasy paper neatly, as if it were something valuable, something she might use again. Her hands had stopped shaking. She began to walk. The town thinned quickly beyond Main Street. Lamps grew farther apart, the pools of light shrinking against the vastness of the territory. A dog barked once in the distance, and silence followed. Elara found a bench near the freight shed, a cold, hard place, but sheltered from the wind, and sat, pulling her coat around her knees. She looked at the dark and let herself think at last. She had not come west to be a beggar. She had not come west to be sold, either. That word sat heavy in her mind, but she did not push it away. Back home, the arrangement had been made with smiles and careful voices, with papers laid out neat on a table, and a promise that everything would be all right if she just did as she was told. She had smiled back then, but she had made no promises of her own. The address in her pocket meant nothing now. The man whose name she had learned by heart had not come. Perhaps he never existed at all. Strangely, that thought stung less than she expected. What hurt was the shape of the night wide, indifferent, full of doors that were not hers to open. But as the taste of the bread lingered, a new resolve began to harden in the cold air. The man with the dark hair and the quiet voice had not saved her future, but he had given her the strength to endure the night. And for now, that would have to be enough. Morning came thin and pale, as if the sun itself wasn't quite sure it belonged in a sky so wide and cold. Elara woke on the bench near the freight shed with a stiff neck and a spine that protested every movement. The tin cup Elias had given her lay empty at her feet, a dark ring marking where the coffee had cooled hours ago. For a moment, in the disorientation of waking, she forgot. Then the cold found its way back into her bones, and memory followed close behind. She stood, brushing the dust from her skirt, and took stock of the world. The town looked different in the daylight planner, less forgiving than it had seemed under the softness of lamplight. What had seemed warm and close-knit the night before now revealed its edges, boarded windows, fences in need of repair, a hitching post with a rail missing, Christmas decorations still hung in places, green boughs tied with twine, a string of paper stars sagging in the morning air. But they felt like remnants of a celebration that had already passed her by. She pulled the folded paper from her coat pocket one last time. The address stared back at her in careful ink, each letter shaped with the patience of someone who believed in order. She walked back to the lot, counting her steps as if the rhythm might summon a different result. It did not. The lot remained empty. No house, no smoke, no sound of life. Elara stood in the dirt and let the truth settle. Whether the man she was supposed to marry had existed or not no longer mattered. What mattered was that she had come west under a borrowed promise, and it had failed her as neatly as her family had. She did not cry. Tears had always felt like a luxury, and she had learned early how to do without them. Instead, she folded the paper and tore it clean down the middle. She tucked the pieces into her pocket, not as keepsakes, but as proof to herself that she would not be waiting on that address anymore. By midday, her feet ached. She had wandered the edges of town, careful not to linger too long anywhere, asking for work that wasn't there. It was near the back of a small clinic, at a water pump, that she saw him again. Elias stood with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, rinsing his hands in a steady stream of freezing water. His movements were practiced, unhurried. A woman waited nearby, her shawl drawn tight, a boy no older than 6 leaning against her hip. The boy coughed a wet, rattling sound that made Elara's chest tighten in sympathy. Elara watched as Elias finished rinsing, shook the water from his hands, and spoke to the woman in a low voice. She nodded, murmured thanks, and led the boy away. Only then did he look up. Recognition passed between them, quiet and immediate. "You find your place?" he asked once they were alone. Elara considered the lie. It came easily enough. She had used it before, when the truth felt too sharp to hand over. But the night before had stripped something from her, and she found she did not miss it. "No," she said. "There isn't one." He did not press. He gestured to the pump. "You can wash up if you like." She did, grateful for the simple kindness of clean water. When she finished, he handed her a scrap of cloth to dry her hands. "You don't look like someone passing through," he said, not unkindly. "I wasn't supposed to," Elara replied, "but I don't intend to go back." "Back where?" She hesitated. "Anywhere that thought it owned me." Elias watched her with an expression she could not read. Then he nodded, as if that answer fit into a shape he recognized. "There are rooms to be had in town," he said. "Not many. Fewer. For women alone? I've noticed." They stood there a moment, the sound of the pump filling the space between them. Elara weighed her next words carefully. She had never liked asking for help. It felt too much like surrender. But last night had taught her something she could not ignore. That need did not diminish a person unless they let it. "I don't need money," she said, her voice steady. "And I won't be a burden. But I do need time. A name that keeps me from being sent on." Elias's brow furrowed slightly. "A name, a husband's name," Elara said plainly. On paper, the words hung in the cold air. She braced herself for refusal, for offense, for the tightening that came when she pushed too hard. Instead, Elias studied her as if he were looking at a wound not to judge it, but to understand its depth. "You're asking for a marriage," he said. "I'm asking for protection from other people's decisions," she answered. "I won't pretend it's romantic. I won't ask you to lie beyond what's written." He leaned back against the pump and crossed his arms. "Why me?" Elara did not flinch. "Because you saw me last night and did not ask who I was before you helped me," she said. "Because you didn't wait to be thanked. And because I think you know what it is to be told where you belong." A long moment passed. Somewhere nearby, a door creaked open. A wagon rolled by, its wheels complaining in the dust. Elias exhaled slowly. "There would be talk," he said. "There's always talk. And expectations. I won't meet them," Elara said. "Not yours. Not anyone's." He looked at her then. Really looked. As if measuring not her words, but the space behind them. "If we do this," he said at last, "it will be simple, honest. No promises we can't keep. That's all I want," she said, and the relief that washed over her was sharp enough to make her dizzy. They were married 2 days later. There was no dress, no gathered crowd, no soft music to mask the transaction. A clerk with tired eyes read the words and took their names down in a ledger already thick with ink. Elias signed with a steady hand. Elara's signature wavered only slightly. When it was done, the clerk nodded and went back to his papers. The moment already folded into the day's work. Outside, the sky had darkened, and snow threatened again. They walked together in silence for a while. Elara felt no sudden transformation, no sense of safety settling like a blanket around her shoulders. What she felt instead was something quieter, a narrowing of the world. As if the path ahead finally had edges she could see. Elias stopped near a modest house set back from the road. "You can stay here," he said. "There's a spare room. You'll have your privacy." "And you?" she asked. "I'll be in the other one." She nodded. "Thank you." He opened the door and stepped aside, letting her enter first. The room was plain but clean. A table, 2 chairs, a small stove that bore the marks of frequent use. Elara set her valise down and straightened. "I should tell you," she said, turning to face him. "This isn't only about surviving." "No," Elias agreed. "It rarely is. There are people who think they can decide my life by signing my name where I won't." Elara went on. "This," she gestured between them, "isn't meant to hurt anyone, but it may stop them." His gaze held hers, steady and thoughtful. "Then we're agreed on one thing." "What's that?" "This marriage isn't about love," he said. "It's about choice." Elara felt something ease in her chest at the word choice. "Yes," she whispered, and though she did not yet know what this new name would cost her, or what it might give. She knew one thing with certainty for the first time in a long while. The next step would be hers to take. Marriage, Elara discovered, did not arrive with thunder. It came quietly. Like dust, settling after a wagon, has passed unremarkable at first, then impossible to ignore. Once it clung to everything. The house Elias brought her to sat on the very edge of town, far enough out that the noise of the saloon and the livery stable softened before it reached the porch. It was a small structure, built with purpose rather than comfort. The boards bore the silvered marks of weather and repair, and the iron stove in the kitchen had been mended more than once by hands that valued usefulness over appearance. Elara liked it immediately, though she would not have said so out loud. It felt honest. They fell into an arrangement without discussion. A choreography of two people determined to occupy the same space without colliding. Elias rose early, often before the sun had fully crested the hills, and returned late. His days were spent moving between patients, old men with aching joints that predicted the rain, women worn thin by childbirth, children with winter coughs that rattled too deep in their small chests. Elara learned the rhythm of the house by listening. She learned the specific creak of the door when he left in the pre-dawn gray. She learned the steady hush of the kettle when it reached its boil. She learned the way the floorboard near the window sighed if stepped on too quickly. At first, they spoke little. It was not out of tension, but caution. Each seemed aware of an invisible line drawn between them, a boundary not enforced by law, but by a mutual, silent respect. Elara took over the cooking because she could not abide idleness. Elias washed the dishes afterward without comment, his large hands moving carefully with the china. When they passed one another in the narrow space of the kitchen, they turned sideways, murmuring apologies that felt unnecessary yet sincere. They moved around each other like respectful ghosts, neither willing to haunt the other. Elara had expected to feel trapped. Marriage, in her experience, was a cage disguised as a home. She had expected demands, the heavy weight of expectations, the inevitable shrinking of herself to fit another person's shape. Instead, she felt unclaimed. No one here told her how to sit or when to speak. No one corrected the sharp edge that sometimes crept into her voice, or frowned when she paced the floor while thinking. Elias noticed everything. She could feel his eyes on her sometimes, dark and observant, but he demanded nothing. It unsettled her more than judgment ever had. The shift began on an evening when the snow had begun to fall in earnest, sealing the house inside a wall of white silence. Elara watched him work for the first time. A ranch hand had come to the door, pale and clutching a forearm where a slipped knife had done ugly work. The blood was already stiffening the man's sleeve. Elara stood by the stove, uncertain whether to retreat to her room or stay. She chose to stay. Pressing herself back against the shadows, Elias sat the man down near the lamp. He spoke softly as he cleaned the wound, his hands sure and gentle. He did not rush. He did not scold the man for his carelessness. He waited for the man's breathing to slow, for the panic to recede. Before he picked up the needle, he stitched as if pain were something that could be persuaded to leave, rather than something that had to be conquered. "You can hand me the water," Elias said without looking up. Elara moved before she thought. She brought the basin. Their fingers brushed brief. Accidental. Elara pulled back too quickly, annoyed at her own skittishness. Elias did not seem to notice. Or if he did, he let it pass without comment. After the man left, grateful and quieter than he had arrived, Elara lingered in the kitchen. She watched Elias wipe his hands, the water turning pink in the basin. "You don't treat them like problems," she said. It wasn't a question, but an observation she hadn't meant to speak aloud. Elias paused. He looked at the towel in his hands, then at her. "People come with problems," he said. "They aren't the same thing." She nodded slowly. The distinction lodged itself somewhere deep in her mind. A seed falling into frozen ground. Days passed. Weeks. Perhaps. Time behaved strangely that winter, stretching and compressing without warning. Elara found work mending clothes for a shopkeeper in town who paid in coin and dry goods. She sat by the window, the needle flashing in the light, stitching other people's tears while her own life held its breath. She began to sleep through the night. The vigilance that had kept her muscles tight for years began to slacken. Her temper, however, remained close at hand. It surfaced one afternoon when a man in town made a careless remark edged with assumption about Elias's heritage and Elara's presence in his house. Elara had answered before thinking, words sharp as broken glass. The man had backed off, muttering, leaving behind a silence that rang in her ears. Later, at home, she braced herself for the lecture, for the warning to be more careful, to be more ladylike. Elias waited until the door was closed. "You don't owe anyone an explanation," he said. "I know," Elara snapped. Then she stopped herself, exhaling hard. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "You did," he said calmly. "And that's all right." She stared at him. "It is." No lecture followed. No correction. Just that. That night, Elara lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her separate room. She thought of Clara, of the way her friend would smooth things over with a smile, coaxing peace with softness. Elara had always assumed softness was a kind of weakness, a surrender. Watching Elias, she began to suspect it was a skill she had never learned. It came to her in small moments. The way he paused before answering, as if giving her words room to settle. The way he listened with his whole body, not just his ears. When she flared, he did not meet her heat with his own. He let it burn itself out. She did not become gentle overnight, but she began to notice the space between feeling and action. She chose, sometimes, to wait. One evening, while stirring a pot of beans, she caught herself humming. The sound startled her. It was a low, wandering tune, something half-remembered from a childhood that felt like another life. She stopped abruptly, embarrassed, the wooden spoon freezing in her hand. When had she last hummed? Elias looked up from the table where he was repairing a bridle. "That song," he said. "Is it from home?" "Not really," Elara replied, looking into the pot as if it held the secrets of the universe. "It just happens." He nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "The good ones do." The marriage remained what it had been declared to be: practical, restrained. They slept in separate rooms. There were no touches that lingered, no words that crossed the line they had drawn. And yet, something shifted all the same. Elara found herself watching for his return at night, listening for the cadence of his steps on the porch. She began to set aside the heel of the bread, the part he liked best, and pretended it was accidental. Elias noticed. He noticed the way she moved the lamp so he could see his work better, and he responded in kind, in a language made of small, silent things. When she read by lamplight, absorbed in a book she had borrowed, he brought her tea without asking. He would set the cup down near her hand, the steam curling into the cool air, and walk away before she could feel obligated to thank him. When he came home, exhausted, the scent of sickness and rain clinging to his coat, she learned not to fill the quiet with questions. She simply poured the coffee and let the silence be a comfort, not a void. Neither of them named what was growing between them. They did not need to. It wasn't a fire that consumed. It was the slow warming of a stone in the sun. For Elara, who had spent her life bracing for the next blow, this invisible care was terrifying. It was seductive. It whispered that perhaps she didn't have to be a fortress. Perhaps she could just be a woman drinking tea in a warm room, safe in the presence of a man who saw her and chose to let her be. One afternoon, a letter arrived. Elara recognized the handwriting before she even broke the seal. It was Clara's careful loops, the way she crossed her T's just a bit too far to the right. A script that spoke of parlors and manicured gardens, worlds away from the dust of the territory. Elara's hands shook as she read. Clara had been worried. Clara had searched. And now, Clara was coming west. Elara sat at the table for a long while, the words blurring together. Elias returned home to find her still there. The letter folded and unfolded until the creases had softened the paper. "You have news," he said, reading the tension in her shoulders. "My friend." Elara replied, "She's coming." He studied her face with that quiet intensity of his. "Is that good?" "Yes," she said immediately. Then, more slowly, "It's complicated." He smiled faintly. "Most important things are." That night, Elara lay awake. But this time her thoughts did not race with fear of the cold or hunger. They circled around a different kind of dread. Clara would see the house, the town, and the man she had married. Clara would ask questions with her eyes, if not her mouth. Elara realized with a clarity that made her breath catch that she did not want Clara to think this life, carefully built life, was a lie. It had begun as a shield. Yes, but somewhere along the way, in the silence of shared meals and the warmth of the stove, it had become something else. Clara arrived on a clear morning when the snow had retreated into the shadows and the road lay bare and honest underfoot. Elara saw her first from the window. She recognized the carriage. And then she recognized the way Clara stepped down, with careful gray skirts, gathered just so, boots touching the ground as if the earth were something that might bruise if she pressed too hard. She looked unchanged, and that nearly undid Elara. Elara opened the door and stepped out into the crisp morning air. Clara turned at the sound and froze. For a heartbeat, they only stared at one another, the space between them charged with years of silence. Then Clara moved quickly, forgetting decorum, and pulled Elara into an embrace that smelled faintly of lavender and clean linen scents that had no business in a frontier town. "You didn't write," Clara said into Elara's shoulder, her voice trembling. "I was terrified." "I know," Elara murmured. "I'm sorry." Clara pulled back, her eyes searching Elara's face with the same thoroughness she'd always used to check for injury. "You look different," she said finally. Elara almost smiled. "I am." They went inside. Clara took in the house with quick, polite glances, the plain furniture, the well-kept stove, the sense of order without ornament. She sat where Elara indicated, folding her hands in her lap, her posture impeccable, despite the long journey. Then the door opened, and Elias entered. Elara stood. She felt suddenly, acutely aware of her hands, of the space she took up in the room. "Clara," she said, "this is Elias." Elias inclined his head. It's good to meet you. Clara rose smoothly, offering her hand. Her smile was courteous, warm, but Elara saw the flicker behind it. It was a brief moment of recognition, not from his words, but from his presence. Clara had always noticed people, especially men who carried themselves with quiet confidence. And this, Elara continued, the words settling into place with surprising ease, is my husband. The room changed. Clara's hand paused in Elias's, just a fraction too long. Her smile faltered, not enough to be unkind, but enough that Elara saw it clearly. Surprise. And then something else. Something shadowed and heavy that Elara could not immediately name. Clara recovered herself with practiced grace. I'm very pleased to meet you, she said. So am I, Elias replied, releasing her hand without emphasis. They spoke of the journey, of the weather, of small things that filled the space politely. But Elara watched Clara listen. She saw the way her friend's attention lingered on Elias's voice, on the calm economy of his movements. A weight settled in Elara's chest, unwelcome and undeniable. Later, when Elias excused himself to tend to a patient, Clara followed Elara to the small back room where the light was softer. You're married, Clara said quietly. And you didn't tell me. I didn't know how, Elara admitted. Clara studied her for a long moment. Is it real? Elara did not pretend to misunderstand. It's legal, she said, and honest. But it didn't begin the way marriages are supposed to. She told Clara everything then. She told her about the address that led nowhere, about the cold and the hunger. She told her about the part of herself that refused to go back and be traded like a ledger entry. She told her about Elias's kindness, offered without inquiry. It was retaliation, Elara said, choosing the word deliberately. Not against anyone here, against the idea that I could be managed, that my future could be signed away without my consent. Clara listened without interruption. When Elara finished, Clara let out a slow breath. You should have told me. I would have helped, I know, Elara replied. That's why I didn't. Clara smiled faintly. Sadness touching the corners of her mouth. You've always been stubborn and brave, Clara added, even when it costs you. Elara looked away, out the window where she could see Elias crossing the yard. His stride was unhurried, his presence steady as the land itself. He's a good man, Clara said softly. He is, Elara answered. Too quickly. Something passed over Clara's face then, so swift Elara almost missed it. A quiet closing, like a door eased shut rather than slammed. Clara folded her hands together, fingers lacing tight until the knuckles whitened. I suppose I should tell you something, too, Clara said. Elara turned back, dread pooling low in her stomach. I've known Elias for some time, Clara continued. Before you ever came west. Elara's pulse quickened. She did not interrupt. My parents did business with a man who sought his help, Clara said carefully. That's how I met him. She paused, her gaze fixed on her own hands. I admired him. His gentleness, his way of seeing people. She looked up, and her eyes were wet. I never spoke of it because I knew it would never be allowed. My family would never accept it. The words landed softly, but their weight was unmistakable. I never acted on it, Clara added quickly. I never would have. Elara closed her eyes. The room seemed suddenly too small, the air too thin. It wasn't betrayal she felt. It was something worse. It was the crushing sense of being an intruder in her own life. "I don't want this to come between us," Clara said. "I don't want secrets." "Neither do I," Elara replied. Her voice was steady, though something inside her ached. "You should know. I didn't marry Elias to wound anyone, least of all you." "I believe that," Clara said, but the seed was planted. The decision Elara made did not arrive with drama. It came the way winter breaks quietly. After long pressure, she did not announce it. She did not gather words and set them before anyone like proof. She simply began the next morning to put distance where closeness had been growing. She rose earlier than usual and left the house before Elias woke. She took on more work in town, cleaning and carrying loads, until her shoulders ached, just to stay away. When she returned, she kept her conversation practical and brief. She smiled, but it was the careful smile she used on strangers. Elias noticed. He noticed everything, but he did not ask her to explain. Not yet. He waited, the way he always did, giving the truth room to come forward on its own. Clara noticed, too. She found Elara one afternoon behind the house, shaking out a rug with a ferocity that spoke of desperation. "You're avoiding him," Clara said quietly. Elara did not deny it. "I'm giving you space." Clara frowned. "I didn't ask for that." "No," Elara replied, steady but tired. "But I should have seen it sooner." She leaned the rug against the fence and wiped her hands on her skirt. "I didn't marry Elias for love. But somewhere along the way, I stopped treating it like a lie. And that isn't fair to either of you." "Elara, this is my fault," Clara began. "No," Elara cut in, gentle but firm. "I chose this marriage. I didn't consider who might be standing in its shadow. I never wanted you to step aside for me," Clara whispered, tears shining in her eyes. "That's why I have to," Elara replied. "Because if I won't, it won't be a choice. It'll be guilt." That evening, Elara told Elias. They sat at the small table, lamplight softening the lines of his face. Elara did not look away as she spoke. She told him about Clara's feelings, not dramatically, not as a confession extracted under pressure, but as a truth that had waited long enough. "I think," Elara said, choosing each word with care, "that the right thing is for me to step back, to give you both room to decide what you want, without me standing between." Elias listened without interruption. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, hands folded loosely before him. "You don't owe me sacrifice," he said at last. "I owe myself honesty," Elara replied. "And I owe Clara the chance not to lose something she's carried quietly for years." Elias's gaze held hers. "And what about what you want?" Elara hesitated. "That, more than anything else, cost her. I don't trust my wanting," she said softly. "Not yet." He nodded once. "Then I'll speak to her." Elias spoke to Clara the next morning. He met her at the edge of town, near the stand of cottonwoods, where the creek cut a shallow, frozen path through the land. She had walked there alone, her coat buttoned to her throat, her hands tucked deep into her sleeves against the wind. Elias did not begin with preamble. He was not a man who believed in softening a blow only to make it bruise deeper later. "Elara told me," he said. Clara inclined her head, her breath pluming in the air. "I hoped she would." They stood side by side, looking out over the water. Elias spoke carefully, not because he feared her reaction, but because he respected her too much to offer anything less than the truth. I care for Elara, he said. Not as an obligation, not as a kindness extended too far. I care for her because I choose to. Clara closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, her expression was calm, though her eyes shone. I suspected as much. And you, Elias continued, turning to face her, deserve clarity. She gave a small, sad smile. I deserve the truth. The truth, he said. Is that what I felt for you years ago? Was admiration. It was a respect for your kindness. But it never crossed into something I could build a life on. I wouldn't be honest if I let you believe otherwise. Clara breathed in deeply, then out. The moment passed through her. Not easily, but cleanly. Thank you, she said, for saying it plainly. She turned to him then, and for choosing her. Elias met her eyes. I didn't choose her over you. I chose what was already growing. Clara nodded. That's enough. The decision was made without spectacle, without wounds left open. But Elara did not know the outcome until that evening. Elias found her in the kitchen. She was scrubbing plates with a ferocity that had nothing to do with dirt. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hands deep in cooling dishwater, her eyes fixed on the task, as if looking away would cause the room to collapse. She was packing the small pieces of her life away in her mind, preparing to run again. He waited until she finished and dried her hands before speaking. She and I talked, he said. We're friends, nothing more. Elara froze. The towel in her hands went still. She closed her eyes, and relief surged through her, followed immediately by something sharper shame. I didn't mean to push you away, she whispered. I thought I was doing the right thing. You were, Elias replied, stepping closer. For the wrong reasons. She laughed softly, a bitter sound, directed at herself. That sounds like me. You were protecting everyone except yourself, he said gently. Elara looked up at him then. The distance she had placed between them evaporated. Old habit, she admitted. Elias did not reach for her right away. He waited, always, until she was ready to be reached. I won't be a refuge you hide inside, he said, his voice low and certain. But I will be a place you choose. Elara felt the last of her defenses give way, not in a collapse, but in a surrender that felt like victory. I choose you, she said, not because I need shelter, but because I want to stay. Elias took her hand then, warm and sure. The grip was steady, not possessive, equal. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces that first morning, when the frost loosened its grip on the fence rails, the creek swelling with meltwater, the birds returning as if they had only stepped away for a moment. The town shook off winter slowly, like a man rising stiffly from a hard bench. But Elara felt the change before she could name it. She woke earlier, not from worry, but from the light. The air smelled different, damp earth and promise instead of smoke and cold iron. She moved through the house with an ease that surprised her. She was no longer measuring every step as if the ground might give way beneath her. It was Elias who suggested the walk. Come see the land, he said one morning. If you want. Elara hesitated only a moment. I do. They set out after breakfast, boots sinking into soft ground, the road west of town stretching open before them. The sky was wide and honest, the kind that made a person feel both small and unburdened. Elara breathed deeply, savoring the simple act of moving forward without running. When they crested a low rise, his land came into view. This isn't much, Elias said. A modest house. A barn in need of paint. But it's steady. The creek runs year-round. The soil is good if you treat it right. Elara took it in the slope of the land, the way the wind moved across the tall, brown grass. It didn't pretend to be a palace. It didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. It's honest, she said. They stood at the boundary for a moment. Elara felt the weight of the choice before her. She thought of the woman she had been on Christmas night, standing outside a window, starving, with nothing but hunger and defiance to keep her company. That woman had believed she needed escape more than anything else. Elara understood now how wrong she'd been. She hadn't needed rescue. She had needed room. Room to choose, to fail, to forgive, and to soften without disappearing. She had carved that space herself, one hard decision at a time. And now, looking at Elias, she realized she didn't need this farm to be whole. She was strong enough to walk away if she had to, and that was exactly why staying meant everything. I already know, she said. Know what Elias asked? That I don't need this place to survive. Elara replied. And that makes wanting it different. Elias held her gaze, something like relief passing through his eyes. That's how it should be. She took a step forward, not onto the land, but toward him. She rested her hand over his heart, feeling the steady beat beneath her palm. It grounded her the way the earth did when she pressed her boots into it. I choose this, she said quietly. Not as a shield, not as a rebellion. As a life I'm willing to build. Elias covered her hand with his own, warm and sure. So do I. They walked down toward the creek together, the ground sloping gently beneath their feet. The water ran clear and cold, singing over stone. There were no vows spoken, no promises made that life would not intrude with its familiar difficulties. They did not need them. The road behind them wound back toward town, toward letters to be written and work to be done. But the land before them lay open, unassuming, full of tasks that asked for patience rather than courage. Elara took Elias's hand. He laced his fingers with hers, not claiming, not yielding, but meeting her where she stood, for the first time in her life. Elara did not feel compelled to know how the story would end. She was no longer running from what had been done to her. She was walking towards something chosen freely. With eyes open and hands unburdened, the creek flowed on, indifferent and enduring. And Elara, no longer a bride by necessity, walked beside the man she had chosen, into a future that asked only this of her, to stay. Thank you for journeying with us today on Echoes of the West. If Elara's story touched something in you, that quiet strength of starting over when the winter is at its coldest, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know. Have you ever had to choose between being safe and being truly seen? And I always love to know where our community is gathering from. Are you listening from the snowy hills of Vermont, the sunny coast of California, or somewhere across the ocean? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like. It helps us keep the campfire burning, and share this video with a friend who might need a reminder that it's never too late to make a new choice. And of course, if you haven't already, subscribe and hit that bell so you never miss a tale from the frontier. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.